39 AD. Rome's most powerful men are sitting around the emperor's dinner table. Senators, generals, men with fortunes, armies, and ancient family names. Their wives are sitting beside them. Then Caligula looks at one of the women. He chooses her. She stands and walks out of the room with him. Her husband stays seated. He doesn't reach for a sword. He doesn't protest. And when she returns, he thanks the emperor. Why? Because Caligula had discovered something more powerful than killing a Roman senator. He had discovered how to make that senator obey him willingly. And the terrifying part is this: Caligula didn't invent the system that made it possible. Rome had already built it. He simply learned how to use it. Before we ask why those senators did nothing, we have to answer a more uncomfortable question. Did this actually happen? Because the story sounds almost too perfectly designed to survive as a legend. An emperor chooses another man's wife in front of him. The husband watches, and then thanks the emperor. So here's the problem. Nobody who wrote this story was actually there. Our most important source is Suetonius, writing decades after Caligula's death. His Life of Caligula gives us the most vivid version of the story, including the banquets, the women Caligula supposedly selected, and the humiliating behavior of their husbands. But Suetonius wasn't writing a courtroom transcript. He was writing a biography of a dead emperor whose reputation had already become part of Rome's political memory. Then there's Tacitus. He was one of Rome's sharpest political historians. But there's a problem. His account of Caligula's reign is largely lost. We don't have his complete version sitting on a surviving page. And then, more than a century after Caligula's death, Cassius Dio tells his own version of the emperor's behavior. Different writer, different century, different political world, and yet the same disturbing pattern appears. Caligula used banquets to humiliate senators by taking their wives in front of them. That convergence matters. It doesn't prove every detail happened exactly as later writers described it, but it makes the basic accusation much harder to dismiss as something invented by a single hostile historian. And here's where the story gets strange. The ancient writers disagree about details. They don't give us a reliable number of incidents. They don't allow us to reconstruct every banquet. They don't give us a private transcript of what happened when a woman left the room with Caligula. But across the surviving tradition, one thing keeps appearing. The husband does not stop him. And that's actually more interesting than the accusation itself. Because if these writers wanted to portray Caligula as an uncontrollable monster, they had every reason to give us a heroic senator who finally stood up. Imagine the scene. One senator rises, a sword flashes, the emperor is confronted. Rome finally produces a man brave enough to resist. That would be an extraordinary story. But we don't have it. Instead, the surviving accounts preserve something much more disturbing: silence. And there's another silence. The historians spend enormous effort describing the humiliation of the husbands, their status, their honor, their submission. But the women at the center of these stories almost disappear. We know they were selected. We know they were taken away. We know their husbands were expected to continue behaving as loyal guests. But what did those women think? What happened to them afterward? The sources barely tell us. And that isn't a small problem. Because we're about to build an entire explanation for why powerful Roman men allowed this to happen, using sources written almost entirely from the perspective of those men. So we need to separate two things: what the evidence actually supports, and what later generations may have added to the story. Because once we strip away the exaggerations, the legends, and everything we simply cannot know, one fact becomes harder to explain, not easier. If Caligula really did this, why did men powerful enough to command Roman armies sit there and let him? The sources leave us with a disturbing accusation. But accusation isn't enough. What did Caligula actually do? Forget the later legends for a moment. Forget the image of a completely unhinged emperor doing whatever entered his head. Go back to the banquet. The room is crowded. Senators are reclining at their places. Their wives are nearby. Wine is being poured. Conversation is moving around the table, and Caligula is watching. According to Suetonius, he would look over the women at his dinner parties and openly evaluate them. Not privately, in front of their husbands, That's the first important detail. Because Caligula already had the power to take whatever he wanted, he didn't need an audience. So why create one? That question changes the entire meaning of the banquet. The first stage was selection. A woman wasn't simply summoned behind closed doors. She was identified in the room, with everyone watching. And that meant every husband understood something before anything else happened. His rank could not protect his household. Then came the second stage, removal. According to the ancient accounts, Caligula would take the chosen woman away from the banquet, sometimes into another room, sometimes elsewhere within the palace. And then something remarkable happened. The banquet continued. The wine kept flowing. The conversation continued. Nobody stopped eating. Nobody rushed after them. The other guests simply waited. And that is where the story becomes psychologically interesting, because everyone in that room now knew what was happening, but nobody could acknowledge it. The emperor had turned silence itself into part of the ritual. Then came the third stage, return. The woman came back to the table. The ancient sources don't give us a reliable account of what happened during the time she was away. That's important. We shouldn't invent details that the sources don't provide, but the aftermath is what the writers emphasize. She returned. The banquet continued. And everyone was expected to behave as though the emperor hadn't just demonstrated that he could remove a senator's wife whenever he wanted. That forced normalcy may have been the most powerful part of the entire performance. Because a single act of violence ends. Humiliation doesn't. It follows you back into the room. It sits beside you at the table. It remains in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. And then comes the fourth stage, gratitude. According to Suetonius, the husband was expected to thank Caligula afterward, effectively treating the emperor's abuse of his power as an act of imperial generosity. And this is where the ritual becomes something much bigger than sexual misconduct, because Caligula wasn't merely taking a woman. He was forcing a powerful Roman man to perform loyalty while being humiliated. Think about what that does to everyone watching. The first senator is forced to thank him. The other senators watch. They understand the lesson. The emperor doesn't need to threaten them individually. They've just watched the consequence happen to someone sitting only a few places away. And now every husband at the table has the same thought. What happens if I'm next? That's the moment the banquet stops being entertainment. It becomes a demonstration. But there's an important caveat. We cannot know that this four-stage sequence happened with perfect consistency every time. The surviving sources were written decades later, and they don't give us enough evidence to reconstruct every incident. So don't imagine a perfectly choreographed ceremony happening at every dinner. The safer conclusion is simpler. Caligula repeatedly used the presence of senators and their wives to turn private sexual power into public humiliation. And that distinction matters. Because if this was simply about desire, privacy would have been easier. A private encounter gives an emperor what he wants without creating unnecessary enemies. A public encounter does something else. It communicates power. And Roman society was particularly vulnerable to that kind of message. A senator's reputation wasn't something he carried privately. His honor existed in public. His family reflected his status. His wife's reputation could affect his standing. His ability to command respect depended partly on the appearance that his household was under his authority. Caligula attacked precisely there. He didn't need to defeat a senator in battle. He didn't need to arrest him. He didn't even need to touch him. He could simply demonstrate, in front of the entire political elite, that there was one boundary their rank could not defend. The emperor could cross it whenever he wanted, and now the question becomes much harder. If these men were powerful enough to command armies, if they had wealth, influence, ancient names, and political connections, why didn't any of them fight back? Because the banquet had already shown them something worse than Caligula's power. It had shown them the price of resisting it. The obvious answer is fear, but fear alone doesn't explain what happened at that table. Because these weren't ordinary men, they were senators. Some commanded provinces, some had military experience. Many belonged to families that had shaped Roman politics for generations. So imagine the moment again. Caligula takes a senator's wife. The husband watches and does nothing. Why? Because the first thing he understands is brutally simple. The emperor is not playing by the same rules. A senator could have wealth. He could have clients. He could have soldiers who respected him. But Caligula controlled the machinery of the state, and one of the most dangerous weapons available to an emperor was maestas, treason against the emperor. Under the early empire, accusations surrounding maestas could turn political hostility, criticism, or alleged disloyalty into a criminal case. And there was another problem. The emperor didn't have to act alone. Informers could bring accusations. Political enemies could suddenly become witnesses. A senator could find himself defending not only his own words, but the interpretation someone else had given them. So resistance wasn't simply, I stand up and fight Caligula. It could become, I stand up, and everyone connected to me becomes vulnerable. That changes the calculation. Because what happens if the senator draws his sword? He probably dies. But what happens to his property, his political allies, his children, his relatives, the people who depended on his household? The danger wasn't necessarily limited to the man who made the first move. And that's exactly why tyranny doesn't always require an army standing behind every chair. Sometimes the threat exists inside the victim's own calculation. What happens to the people I leave behind? That question can stop a man more effectively than a soldier holding a sword. But there's an even deeper problem. Roman senators weren't simply protecting their lives. They were protecting their status. Their entire political world was built around reputation, dignity, family honor, and public standing. A senator could survive being insulted privately, but being publicly humiliated in front of the men whose respect he needed was something different. And Caligula understood that. He didn't just threaten the body, he attacked the identity. The senator's wife becomes the weapon, the banquet becomes the battlefield, and the other senators become the witnesses. That's why one man's humiliation could control 20 men who weren't directly touched. Every senator watching had to imagine himself in the same position. If I resist now, what happens to my family tomorrow? And there's something else. Rome had already seen what happened to men who challenged imperial power. Executions, exile, confiscation of property, forced suicide. The exact circumstances varied from case to case, and the ancient sources often give us too little evidence to know precisely why every individual senator was punished. But the broader lesson was unmistakable. The emperor could destroy a senator, and everyone in that room knew it. So perhaps the question isn't, why didn't they fight? Perhaps the better question is, what would fighting actually have achieved? One senator stands, he draws his sword, he kills, or attempts to kill the emperor, and then what? Maybe the palace guard kills him immediately, maybe his family pays the price, maybe Rome descends into another succession crisis, maybe another emperor takes Caligula's place, and the same political machinery survives. The individual act of resistance might feel heroic, but from the senator's perspective, it could also look like suicide with collateral damage. And that's what makes the silence so disturbing. These men weren't necessarily incapable of courage. They were trapped inside a system where courage had become extraordinarily expensive. But Caligula still had a problem. Fear could make a man obey. It couldn't necessarily make him thank the person humiliating him. Yet according to the ancient accounts, that's exactly what the husband was expected to do. And that changes everything. Because now Caligula wasn't satisfied with controlling what these men did. He wanted to control what they were willing to perform. And once the emperor realized that humiliation could be turned into a public performance of loyalty, the banquet became something far more dangerous than a place to eat. Because if Caligula only wanted a woman, he didn't need an audience. He had the palace, he had guards, he had absolute authority. He could have summoned someone privately and nobody at the banquet would ever have known. But according to the ancient accounts, he didn't keep the humiliation private, he performed it. And that tells us something important. The woman was only one part of what Caligula was trying to control. The real audience was the room. Think about the first senator watching this happen. Caligula selects his wife. She leaves. The husband stays. Every man around the table watches what happens next. And then she returns. The husband thanks the emperor. Now imagine being the senator sitting 3 places away. You haven't been touched. Your wife hasn't been selected. Your life hasn't changed. But you've just learned exactly what can happen to you. That's the power of a public demonstration. A private threat controls one person. A public humiliation can control everyone who witnesses it. And Caligula didn't even have to explain the lesson. The room explained it for him. Your rank will not protect you. Your wealth won't protect you. Your family name won't protect you. And if the emperor chooses you, your only safe response is obedience. That's why the banquet matters. It wasn't simply where the abuse happened. It was where the message was delivered. And Roman banquets were particularly useful for this because they were already performances of status. Who sat where mattered. Who was invited mattered. Who received attention mattered. Who spoke first mattered. The emperor wasn't sitting at an ordinary dinner table. He was surrounded by the men who formed the political elite of Rome. So every humiliation happened in exactly the environment where reputation mattered most. And that's what makes the forced gratitude so important. If Caligula had simply taken a woman and sent her husband away afterward, the message would have been, I can hurt you. But if the husband has to return to his place, continue drinking, continue smiling, and thank the emperor, the message becomes, I can make you participate in your own humiliation. That's much more powerful, because now everyone watching isn't just afraid of what Caligula can do. They're watching another man demonstrate what obedience looks like. And that creates a psychological trap. The first senator submits. The second senator sees it. The third senator sees both. Soon nobody needs to be threatened individually. The room begins policing itself. A man doesn't have to ask, will Caligula punish me? He only has to look around and think, what did the last man do? And the answer is obvious. He stayed seated. He smiled. He thanked the emperor. So the next man does the same. This is where the popular explanation of Caligula as simply mad becomes inadequate. We obviously cannot diagnose an ancient emperor from stories written generations after his death, and we cannot know exactly what was happening inside Caligula's mind during any individual banquet. But the behavior described by the sources had a very specific effect, whether or not he consciously designed every detail. It turned private power into public control, and that distinction matters. A tyrant who acts randomly creates fear. A ruler who makes an example of someone creates anticipation. Everyone begins imagining themselves as the next victim, and anticipation can control people before anything actually happens to them. That may explain why the other senators didn't need to be physically threatened every time. They had already seen the demonstration. They knew the rules. And Caligula had another advantage. He could make the humiliation look almost normal. The wine continued. The conversation continued. The guests remained seated. Nothing in the room visibly collapsed. And that's important because systems of power become especially effective when they can turn something horrifying into something ordinary. The emperor takes a woman. The husband waits. She returns. The husband thanks him. Then dinner continues. Nothing happened. At least, that's what everyone was expected to pretend. And perhaps that was the most important part of all. Because once a room learns to pretend that something terrible is normal, the people inside it don't need to be physically forced into silence anymore. They begin doing it themselves. But there's still one question we haven't answered. If the men were the targets of the humiliation, what happened to the women who were actually taken? The ancient historians had plenty to say about the senators, almost nothing about them. And that silence may reveal something even darker about the world that allowed Caligula's banquet rituals to work. The banquet ended. The guests went home. The wine was cleared away, and Rome continued as if nothing had happened. But for the people inside that room, nothing was normal anymore. Because humiliation doesn't end when the emperor leaves. It follows you home. For some senators, the sources describe a much darker ending. Men took their own lives during Caligula's reign. Others were prosecuted, exiled, or executed after falling under suspicion. We have to be careful here. The surviving sources don't allow us to say that every suicide was caused by one particular banquet or one particular humiliation. Caligula's reign was filled with political accusations, personal conflicts, and executions. But the broader pattern is clear enough. Men who challenged the emperor could disappear, and everyone else learned from watching them. That left a third group, the largest one, the survivors, men who swallowed their anger, Men who said whatever words were required. Men who returned to the Senate the next morning. Men who accepted another invitation to another imperial banquet. And that is the group history has the least to say about. Because surviving under tyranny doesn't produce dramatic stories. There is no heroic final speech, no sword raised in defiance, no martyrdom, just another morning, another meeting, another dinner, another decision to keep your head down. Imagine our senator walking back into the palace months later. The same walls, the same table, the same emperor. And now he knows exactly what can happen. He doesn't need to be threatened. The memory is the threat, but then we have to return to the people at the center of the story, who have received the least attention, the women. This is where the ancient sources become painfully thin. Suetonius tells us which women Caligula selected in some accounts. Dio gives us additional incidents. But what happened after those encounters? How did their husbands treat them? What happened to their marriages? Did they become socially isolated? Were they blamed for something they had no power to prevent? Did any of them speak privately about what happened? We don't know. And that uncertainty matters, because the ancient historians weren't primarily interested in documenting the inner lives of women caught inside political violence. They were interested in emperors, senators, power, honor, scandal. So the women often appear not as people with their own stories, but as evidence of what Caligula did to men. That tells us something about Rome itself. The humiliation worked partly because Roman society connected a man's public honor to the behavior and reputation of his household. Caligula exploited that structure, but the cost wasn't paid only by the husband. The woman was the person physically removed from the room. Yet history often remembers her primarily as the instrument through which her husband's humiliation was delivered. And then there's the final irony. Caligula's reign didn't last. In 41 AD, barely 4 years after becoming emperor, he was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard and others involved in the conspiracy against him. The man who had seemed untouchable was suddenly dead, but the political machinery that had allowed him to intimidate Rome's elite didn't disappear with him. The emperor changed, the system survived. That's the part worth remembering. Caligula wasn't powerful simply because he was personally terrifying. He inherited a political world where the emperor possessed extraordinary leverage over senators, where accusations could destroy careers, where public reputation mattered enormously, and where resistance could carry consequences far beyond the individual who resisted. He didn't build all of that. He exploited it. And perhaps that's why the story remains so disturbing, because the real lesson isn't that one supposedly mad emperor did something monstrous. It's that the people around him already lived inside a system capable of making the monstrous seem survivable. The banquet ended. The senators went home. The next morning, Rome opened for business. And that may have been the most frightening part of all. So go back to the question we opened with. Why did nobody stop him? Not because every senator was a coward, because they lived inside a system where resisting the emperor could cost a man his life, his family, his fortune, and everything he had spent generations building. Caligula understood that. He didn't need to kill every senator. He only needed to make everyone watching believe that obedience was safer than resistance. And that's what made the banquet so powerful. One man's humiliation became another man's warning. One forced thank you became an entire room's lesson. But here's the darkest part. Caligula didn't create that machine. Rome had already built it. He simply learned how to use it. In 41 AD, Caligula was assassinated. His reign ended, but the machinery of imperial power survived. The emperor died. The machine didn't.